Welcome, everyone. This is Michelle Rapp. I am the Associate Director of Alumni Career Strategy in the Office of Alumni Relations. Today's webinar is part of our Career by Design programming for alumni and the Northeastern community, and we're very happy to have you joining us. One housekeeping note is it's helpful for us in just knowing who is attending if you can just type your name and graduation year in the chat box on the left-hand side. We are also going to leave questions till the end of Tricia's presentation, and you can also type your questions into the chat box when we get to that point. And we're delighted that you're joining us today and that there was really strong interest in this webinar. So I want to start out by introducing Tricia Griffin-Carty. Tricia is passionate about the power of stories, and her expertise is in helping clients create and deliver dynamic presentations. As a speaker, communications coach, and facilitator, she works with clients from financial services, technology, manufacturing, and higher education. Tricia's signature work is about the art and science of storytelling and increasing one's impact in the workplace, including meetings, presentations, and interviews. She's a Northeastern alumna holding a Master of Arts in English. And I can say I've had the pleasure of knowing Tricia for a number of years and attending several of her presentations. So I know firsthand that this will be an engaging and informative session. Again, we will leave questions for the end, and you'll be able to type those into the chat box. And I'm going to turn it over to Tricia.
Well, Michelle, thank you very much for that warm welcome, and I want to say good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's on the webinar, depending on what part of the world you're in. I'm coming to you from the greater Boston area, and it's absolutely a beautiful, sunny fall day. What better time than to think about what's your story and how we can use it effectively. So for the next bit of time, we're going to do a couple of things. I really want to talk a little bit about the power of stories, where do they come from, and then how do we actually create them. So that's a pretty ambitious agenda. So I'm going to go through and give you some tips and tools at each point. But I thought I would start with a little bit of my own background. And to do that, I have to go way back and say that one of my earliest memories is being reprimanded by my mom for talking too much. Talking to the neighbors, talking to my teachers, talking to people in stores, basically anyone who would listen. And as I think about it now, that was probably my first beginning, my interest in hearing, not only telling my story, whatever it was, but also in learning about others. Well, luckily, I kind of went on to college and majored in literature and found myself just enthralled by the stories of writers, and then made my career as an educator for a number of years, where I worked with students helping them identify and craft their own stories. So when I started my business, strangely enough, I didn't start with stories, but I started as a consultant working on career issues, management development topics, etc. And after several years of doing that, I went to a career coach and I said, I just think there's something missing. I just find that I'm just not as invested or as connected with some of the topics that I'm delivering. And after she spoke with me for a while and listened, she suddenly put down her pen, looked at me, and she said, you should be telling stories. You should be working on helping others tell their stories. Now, at that point, one would think the light bulb would go off and it would be a big aha moment. Sadly, that wasn't the case. I remember looking at her and saying, really? Are you kidding? Who would hire me to do that? Well, flash forward quite a number of years, and that's exactly what I do. As Michelle indicated, my signature work is working with others to identify, to craft, and to deliver their stories so that they can manage their careers, achieve career success, and basically move ahead in their own life story. So that's a little bit about who I am. And I thought it would be helpful to start with, why are we even thinking about story? Why use it? Well, the research is really in something that we knew intuitively, I think, for a long time, has really been proven now. There's a lot of brain research going on, particularly at Princeton University with Professor Yuri Hassan, talking about how story has impact. Story has power. It's not new. Story has been around since the earliest of times. We can talk about cave drawings or stories told in the oral tradition. things that were passed on about a culture, tales of warning, stories of origin. Today, stories are being used in business, nonprofits, academia. They're used to raise money, tell students about their university, highlight how a business works from its operations to its customers. So back to why story? Well, you can tell someone about you, your business, or your idea, and that goes so far. Or you can create an environment, you can deliver a message that really gets to the heart of the matter, that shares an experience that they, the listener, can then use to create their own frame of reference. And that's the power of story, that a story ignites a reaction in the listener and hopefully encourages him or her to take a step. So we can use this in a number of different ways. By the way, this particular slide, there is actually a story street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my only concern with this slide is that it's a one-way street, and story is definitely much more than that. There are many ways to tell an effective story. So what makes a story to begin with? Well, time, place, characters. These are some of the key elements. We'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of it creates the context. The situation, the tension, and the outcome is the action. And both of these are really critical, both of these components. If we are simply delivering an account, we can say, you know, I was at a team meeting and we decided. But if we're going to tell a story, it was September 16th, it was 10 o'clock, people came late to the meeting, and you know, who was there, what were we discussing, and you begin to weave in the elements of much more than an account. Now, two critical components to something that makes a story is the use of both logic and emotion. Every story needs that framework through which we can view and understand events. Sometimes people refer to it as it's sequential, it's the rational part. It also needs emotion. It needs to touch us. It needs to draw us in, engage us, and make us want to know more. So if only logic is involved, I think we're talking more about an account or an update or a briefing. They most certainly have their place. If we only have logic and leave out the emotion, we can accomplish certain objectives. If we only have emotion, a great deal of feeling, then that can touch someone, but how much they'll remember about the message is somewhat questionable. Bottom line, we really need both. So what makes a story? All of these components. And I say this believing that everybody on this call has a strong sense of their own stories and use stories all the time, whether we're so conscious of it or not. So I've talked just a bit about kind of what is story, what makes a story. Well, where do they come from? And this is, I find, an interesting consideration. I think that stories come from three large sections. And the first is that personal or professional experience. So I told you a little bit at the beginning, you know, when I said just a kind of a little bit about my own story, personal and professional experience. A second kind of story is one that could be told to you, or perhaps one that you've observed. So it's not exactly, you have not been the prime character in it, but you've been witness to it. The third kind of story, which is the third person, is basically everywhere else. It's social media, books, posts, blogs, movies, songs, ripped from the headlines, everyday events. So these are things that we think about as far as where do I find stories? I think the answer is they are everywhere. It is a matter of being open to an event and seeing that as having the possibility of being a particular story. Now, if we've got all these stories, well, where do I start? What's the right story to tell? You know, there are so many. And this is a definition that I use, and I'm going to explain this as we go through our webinar a bit more. But you have a lot of experiences. You want to pick perhaps an event that becomes a story, it aligns with your purpose. In other words, why are you telling this? It supports your message, what is your content, and it engages the audience. So this is the yardstick or the metric that I use when I'm trying to decide if I'm interviewing, if I'm doing a presentation, if I'm meeting a new client, if I'm coaching. You know, of all the stories, you know which one to pick. It aligns with my purpose, supports my message, engages the audience. Because really, stories are not one size fits all. They are highly different depending on any of those factors. Now, I think there's all kinds of places where we can use stories, and I'll be asking you for some information in just a little bit. But here are some of the applications or some of the venues where I found stories to be extremely effective. And as you can see, looking at that, sort of the top half of that slide deals a little bit with career search, informational interviews, job interviews, cover letters. But then as we move down the slide, it begins to move into our everyday work lives. Development discussions, performance appraisals. These are great places for individuals to have thought about, identified, developed, and to deliver stories about what they've been doing on their job. So there is really no lack of places where we can put story to use. But what about you? Inquiring minds want to know. And there are a couple of things I'd like to know about you. And Michelle, I'm going to hand this back to you in just a moment because I'm curious as to the audience. Where do you want to use stories? Primarily job interviews, networking, presentations, other. I'd be very interested if we could take a moment. And Michelle, I'll hand this back to you to see how we could have people do a quick response to our first poll.
Okay, so you can use the chat box to type in where you're primarily wanting to use stories. Job interviews, networking, presentations, or maybe you've got something else. So please type into the chat box and we'll get a sense of our audience. Interviews, networking, presentations. Okay, so we have a lot of things coming in around networking, interviewing. Someone mentioned sales calls, corporate relations, presentations, industry announcements, and even mentoring. But I think networking and interviewing was high on the list. Film and media also came up. Coaching, presenting to employees. So lots of different uses here. I'll turn that back to you, Tricia.
Okay, great. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, I would agree that I think it looks like a lot of it is interviewing and networking related, but nice representation on some of those other areas as well. So let's start with a client of mine. We'll call him Mark. We're going to meet Mark. And I'll use an example, Mark is an example of how I worked with him, and he was someone who was moving into a job search, and how we worked on his moving from an account to an accomplishment to a story. But as I describe the story of Mark, I think that you'll see that there are a lot of applications for some of these other areas, both in networking and in presentations. So the story of Mark is that a few years ago, I was working for a career transition firm, and I was delivering workshops and coaching clients in transition. And one of my clients was Mark. He was a manager with a large financial services firm. It had a strong local presence in Boston, but also international. And after several years, like many of us, he found himself looking for his new job. His organization was going through some changes. He had some great experience, and when we first met, he filled me in on a lot of the duties associated with his last role. He was a hard worker, fast-paced environment, And even though he had a strong sense of all the things he had done, he was having some trouble moving from his duties or his key responsibilities. He was a project manager, to creating sort of accomplishments that would reflect his value. So he wrote several drafts of his resume. He was getting kind of frustrated. He was having difficulty explaining on interviews exactly what he did and how he did it. So we started to think about that, and the first thing was that I noticed is that Mark had some difficulty seeing what his accomplishments were. He could reel off those responsibilities, and when I asked him to focus on things that stood out for him, more than once, this is what I heard him say. Well, I don't know, I can't really talk about that. I was just doing my job. So one of his strengths was that he was very straightforward, and yet his description of his work was more of a recitation of things done, not accomplishments. And there was another blocker involved, and it looked like this. So concerned about bragging. And this is something I find with many clients I've worked with. That's the last thing he wanted to do was brag about his work. The funny thing is, he was in no danger of doing that. And really, the individuals I work with, this is so far removed from their actual experience. But the fear is there. And so I asked him to think about a project or an assignment that he played a key role in, and pretty easily he came up with a project he'd work on and off with for a while, and here's what we worked on. Now again, this is sort of at the beginning. On the left-hand side, he said, well, I was on a team, we opened a new office, great group of people, we met the deadline, everything went well. That was sort of like a black and white, square one, you know, very literal account of what he had done. It was a little bit more detailed, but not a whole lot. Well, it was very linear, step by step, very much the facts, just the facts. And yet there was so much more that actually he had accomplished. So through a series of open-ended questions, we talked about how he was selected to lead this team, that the new office was in India, which he had not mentioned, that it was an international virtual team he was leading, that there were some bumps in the road, some challenges. And I remember saying to him, gee, it's too bad you didn't get to go to Delhi to actually do the implementation of this. And he said, oh, I was there. I was there for 3 weeks on site. Kind of an important detail that had been left out. And then we talked about the results, the benefits to the team, the clients, and the organization. We're beginning to move towards story, from an account to an accomplishment. So I think we can see that this is where a lot of us get stuck. Whether it's a presentation or it's telling the story of your organization or it's a sales call, we don't want to brag. At the same time, we are in danger, I think, of minimizing the message to our audience. So I call it kind of the things that get in the way, and these are indeed the orange cone moments. So this is my own personal orange cone that I have outside my home in the winter when there's ice. And it's to warn people about things, but they also slow people down. So thinking about that, what are some of those pieces that sometimes get in our way? It could be doubt, uncertainty, maybe a little bit of confusion, as it was with Mark. So we're going to take another quick poll, and it looks like this. I'm going to ask you to respond once again really quickly. What are your orange cones, the things that get in the way from you, get in the way for you? The first one I hear a great deal of, I just don't have any stories. I have a few that are very good. I don't like talking about myself. I'm good to go on a lot of this. I have no idea where to start. So Michelle, could I hand that back to you and ask for some more comments from our participants?
Absolutely. So folks could just type their orange cone responses into the text box. We'll get a sense of what people are thinking about. Okay, so it looks like there's some discomfort talking about ourselves. concern about bragging. Bullet number 3 came up a couple times. And also being able to focus in on a story or tell the story with focus. I'm comfortable talking about myself. Concerns about bragging.
Interesting, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for doing that. Again, it gives me some additional information. So with that, let's take it to you. Now, I'm thinking about some of the items that you've mentioned and some of the orange cones as well as some of the situations that you are interested in using stories. So let's start with really a very important place to start with. Who is your audience? So now we're at the point where we're thinking about, okay, how do I begin to develop, how do I begin to put together? Before we begin to really think about a story arc or a storyline, you have an idea, but who is your audience? Is it someone you are networking with? Is it a job interviewer? Is it a potential client in sales? If you are mentoring someone, you know, you really need, those are very different groupings. So it's really helpful to think about that audience. What do you know about them? And by the way, I use audience when I mean audience of 1 or audience of 100. So, you know, who are they? How technical, non-technical are they? How much knowledge do they have of the message that I'm going to deliver? And most importantly, what do they really care about? So when you're starting to think about all of these items, you know, where I want to use a story, we start with the audience. So who is the person or who are the persons that I want to deliver, communicate, share a story with? Next up, 2 very important pieces, purpose and message. So the purpose, if you take a look at this, these are sort of the taglines. You know, what do you want the listener to know, think, feel, do, and remember? And I would break that down a little bit more. What do I want them to know? So what information do I want to share? What do I want people to think? Well, that's really what kind of opinion do I want to help shape for them about me or my message? To feel, what kind of emotion do I want to evoke? To do, it's really about action. What do I want them to do is take the next step, you know, set up a second call, second interview, bring in my team to do a presentation if I'm selling a product. And because, again, the bottom line is always to remember. What do I want them to remember? So the purpose is the why, and once I get that down, then my message becomes the what. So for my message, I want people to know I'm an experienced project manager. I want them to think of me as really fitting in. I want them to think that my firm offers a product or service that is really going to be helpful to them. I want them on an emotional level to feel they can trust me, for example. And again, I want them to move on to get to the next step. Out of all the candidates, out of all the sales pitches they're going to hear, I want to stand out. So I have my purpose and message. And once I have that in place, then I can move on to what's called setting the stage. So I'm going to stop here for a moment because I think the areas that we've covered so far are really critical as first steps. And it's funny because story is both an art and a science. And in many ways, people can tell a story at the drop of a hat. But we're talking about using story with a purpose, and in the examples that you gave me. Also, I want to think about those blockers a little bit. I'm not sure which story to tell. Kind of go back and think about again, you know, what's the right story. I don't know how to focus on a story. I think sometimes it's just trying some things out with a safe audience, you know, and asking for some feedback is a good way to do it. And also, maybe I don't know how to tell a story. I think that sometimes we have been the recipient of both really, really good examples and really poor examples of storytelling. On the really good side, we've got the TED Talks and we've got the Moth and just, you know, other organizations where we hear absolutely amazing individuals tell riveting stories. On the really poor side, we have both in social settings and career business settings, oh, we have that speaker who rambles on, and we have no idea what the point is, and we don't really care. After a very short period of time, we lose interest. So I think there's a lot of validity for us to say, I'm just not really sure if I have the confidence or whatever. So much of it is taking a look at some of these things and then just trying it out. And so thinking about that, I want to pick up now with context. So we're moving on a little bit. Context is really set the stage. Context is a scene. It's a moment in time. And this might help with people thinking about how do I choose. So, you know, for Mark, my client, he could have told me many stories, but he started to tell me about this project, and I said, paint a picture for me. And he said, okay, it was the first phone call, and people were on the call, and I was leading it, and they weren't really sure why they were there, and neither was I, and there was a lot of silence. And I thought, he just set me up to really be interested in what comes next. So he gave another example where he said, there were 6 of us. It was one of our last calls, and we're located in the U.S., Canada, and England. We had 3 months to pick up where an earlier team had left off and get our new office up and running in Delhi, India. Boom, I'm there. I can see that phone call. I can see the challenge. So there are lots of ways to begin, but if you think in terms of a scene, think of a picture. It's a moment in time. Are we inside, outside? Are people there? Are they about to enter? Have they just left? Movies. The first scene in a movie is very important because it sets the stage for us. So that's one of the areas to think about. And then, as mentioned earlier, something has to happen to make this a story. Otherwise, it's an account. It's something that we can read about, and it's very sequential, it's very linear. This is the part of the story. It is definitely a sequence of events. And here's some taglines to, you know, first this happened, and then we get to the high point, and finally, and we get to our outcomes. Now, in the story or the sample story that I share with you in the beginning about my own background, I said that I'd been doing stories for a long time and that I had really liked them and that I was just wrapped up in them. And then I went to the career coach and was trying to figure out my next step, and she said, you should be doing this. I would call that probably the high point. I think you could hear the tension building up in that. I'm not sure what to do. That would be the high point, that moment of revelation. And then the outcome in the story that I shared, there was actually a part where I said, so I realized that, you know, the truth was right in front of me, but I couldn't see it. Now, if I were doing a presentation, I would tell the story that way, so that I would use a little bit of a, here's what I learned, here's what I realized, what I noticed, and that would be the ending of my sequence of events. If I'm in a job interview, it's a little bit different because I want the ending. And so the project was completed ahead of time and we were recognized for it, and some of those systems are still in place within the company. You know, so it's different because it's really about the experience, and I'm highlighting some skills. So it's kind of an important distinction here. Again, back to purpose. You know, why are you telling the story? Who is your audience? What do you want to communicate? So if I am working on an industry announcement, for example, you know, I'd have to ask myself those questions. And then I'm guessing that probably I'm drawing people to my business. I'm drawing something new and exciting is happening. And what does that mean for you, the current customer or potential customer? Again, interviews, networking would be slightly different. So that's where you see, I hope, a little bit of a distinction. But again, when we talked earlier about what makes a story, we said time, place, characters, and events. The key message depends back very much to who is my audience, why am I telling the story, what is my message? And those will be the drivers. And I think that if we ask those questions as we go through, it gets a lot easier to pick a story and find one that will fit into It aligns with my purpose, supports my message, and resonates with my audience. Sort of just all loops back around again. One of the things that we do want to make sure we add in is not to forget the drama. And by this, I don't mean high drama, but a story should have some tension to it. Tension in the sense that I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen. Back to the case of Mark, something that came about that he included in one version of his story was the unexpected loss of a key team member. Pulled off the team, last minute to handle a crisis on another project. Her loss was significant. What looked like was a really clear path to getting this office open became, much more difficult. So there needs to be a little bit of tension in the sense of drama, a little bit of, how is this going to work? Oftentimes, I will find that, quote, stories, when people are telling stories, it lacks that. It looks very straightforward. It was very easy. There were no obstacles. There were no orange cones. There were no challenges. Well, okay, that's more of an account. But think back to any story you've heard. There's usually like, wow, what's going to happen here? It may be an internal struggle of a character. It may be facing external challenges. So again, it doesn't have to be high drama, but there should be a question, a little bit of creative tension there to make me wonder how this is going to turn out. Once again, that'll hold my attention as a listener. Part of creating that tension and part of creating the context and the scene is the use of detail. And the sensory details are wonderful. The research bears out that if we include a couple at least, taste, touch, smell, hear, sound, it does so much more to anchor it in the listener's memory. So when you pick a scene and you're bringing it to life, do spend a moment. It could be something as simple as it's a beautiful fall day in Boston, in the greater Boston area, and it's 10 o'clock, and I'm sitting at my desk, and I'm just, turned on my email, and I'm checking. It could just be that small, simple kind of detail that creates the picture in the individual's mind. And we're not done. We have a couple more things. There's more. Been talking a lot about the content and the process. Again, back to the power of story, how to choose stories, how to create stories. But there's more. Delivery really counts. And by that I mean it's so important to bring yourself to the story. Now, bringing yourself to the story is a way to not only engage the listener, but it's a way for you to show that you are interested in this, that you have a stake in this, that this is an important topic. And you can do this through your voice, through your facial expressions, through body language. And I find that if you look around and you find people in your life telling stories about their families or about something that happened on a business trip, they're doing it. It's there. They are just unconsciously in the moment and they're reliving it with you. What happens sometimes when we say, okay, now I'm, quote, in my own mind telling a story, is that I think we forget to do that. If you're not interested, if I don't sense that you're interested through your pace and your volume and your inflection and your smile and all of that, if you're not interested, why should I be? And I may be unfairly assuming you're not interested, but that's the impression that I'm getting if it's kind of a flat, same old, this happened, kind of delivery. So something to think about there. Content, delivery, logic, emotion. Again, these pieces all just, double back on each other. Here are some ways that I just threw in a quick slide here on how to practice or enhance, I guess I would say, some of your delivery tips. And if you look at the top of the slide, I think some of those are self-explanatory, but practice, phone a friend, take one word like seriously, popular television shows, still on, Grey's Anatomy, in the early years, used the word seriously in so many different ways. Pause, read to yourself, take on a different persona and see how that sounds. I have happy birthday over here, sometimes just singing happy birthday in a number of different ways, you know, just to get your vocal inflection going a bit more. Be your own Siri. Do Q&A with yourself. You know, use your cell phone and just try to say the same thing, but say it in some different ways. And by the way, using your cell phone is a great way. Once you have a draft of your story down, is say it into the cell phone, play it back. Don't worry so much about how you sound initially, but simply listen for flow, for content, and then you can also use it later on for delivery tips. So again, thinking about the story is about time, place, characters, action. It's also about how I hear it as the listener, and that's where delivery comes in. Now, it's really important to know you don't have to be this highly experienced presenter. You don't have to be on TED Talks or on the Moth, you know, to tell a story effectively. And if you look around and ask people to talk to you about something they enjoy doing, or a movie they really like seeing, or a restaurant that they like, or a favorite vacation spot, you'll see those things almost naturally come out. So a couple of reminders here as we move towards this portion and some of these takeaways. The glasses are up there. Start scanning your environment. Absolutely start looking around and just noticing. And they can be very small moments. Standing in line at a store, you might see an interaction, something that might fit in well with a talk on customer service. The Post-its in the center, this is a way to track all your ideas, and I'll call them ideas first before they become stories. I try to jot things down either on a Post-it or I use my iPhone and I record an idea. You don't need a full-fledged story. It could just be the Staples. I have a story about being at Staples a couple of years ago and watching some customer interaction. So it's a way to kind of collect things, and you can use, you know, your PowerPoint. You can do simply a paper Post-its. You can use this on your iPad, whatever way you want to use it. But create a story bank. That's what that represents. A story bank or story portfolio where you can go to. And I go to this all the time for ideas to see, again, what might be the right story that I want to use in a situation. You'll see over to the right, we've got the box. This is the toolbox. You know, give yourself some things to pull out. Practice, you know, this is key. Say the story out loud a few times. You may never say it the same way exactly twice. That's okay. But each time you'll probably get something a little bit different from it. And it adds to your understanding as well as the understanding of your listeners. And down the bottom right there, I really think it is to own it, you know, to feel that it doesn't have to be story in caps and bold. The best stories are often the small moments, the very small moments that can be used in a small way to almost share that has a wider application. So again, back to customer service moments. You know, they apply in so many different ways. Many times we feel, oh, I have to have a big, big story. I call that the Mount Everest story. I need to have climbed Mount Everest. Well, I've heard people speak who did climb Mount Everest, and it was fascinating, and it was just amazing. I am never going to climb Mount Everest. So my connection with them was one of admiration. I didn't feel that I was ever going to do this. However, when I heard someone tell the story about an embarrassing moment or a lesson learned, when I heard a CEO talk about something he learned earlier in his career, and it was a mistake, and it was not good, and what he did about it, and it not only did I think about his experience, but it made me think about my own experience and where have I had lessons learned, and what did they contribute to my growth as a professional. So again, there's one of my favorite authors, a gentleman named Sean Callahan, talks about the best stories are stories with a small s. Stories with a small s. And he calls them, he said, stories are like kind of the handbook of life. So I think that's something helpful to think about. Now, some of you mentioned sales and also the industry story or the company story. Look for the small moments. It applies there as well. Look for the small moments, and you'll see that you can really say a lot about that topic without going to the big event. If you've got the big event, use it. But there are many more smaller moments that can have really powerful connections with your audience. So what will you do next? And I'm hoping that you have some ideas from our session. I'm going to stop in a moment and take questions. I'm hoping that you're going to find a way to think about a place to use a particular story, look for that story, start your portfolio, maybe practice one element, use more details. And it's really up to you what you do next, because after all, it is your story. And that's, if I were to label one, those personal/professional experiences, those direct experiences tend to be the most powerful. It's not to say you can't use the second or third person ideas, but that direct experience tends to be, I think, the one where we can get behind the most and really feel that passion comes through, that interest, that investment, and that is something that travels very, very well to your listener. So now I'm going to stop talking and turn this back over to Michelle. And Michelle, let's see, do we have some questions? I think we're going to take some questions for a little bit.
Thank you, Tricia. This is great information. So this is a perfect time for all of you to pose any questions to Tricia, perhaps thinking of your own story scenarios or situations that you're facing, as well as Tricia's content here. And so you can just type a question into the chat box. And while people are thinking, I'm going to throw out a question I have. I think sometimes people, Tricia, worry about how entertaining they have to be. How do you deal with that?
Great question. Telling an effective story, particularly in a business or career setting, is not the same as telling a joke or a humorous story. So they're very different things. So I don't think we have to worry about being entertaining. I think the focus there is to be engaging. And by engaging, I mean giving some detail, building up the action a bit so that your listener continues to be attentive. I think that some people might have kind of maybe they're a little bit more naturally, they can gear towards humor, but I'm very careful with that. And I think you can tell a great story without really worrying about being humorous or being too entertaining. And Michelle, yeah, I just thought of something too. One thing that I would suggest, and I meant to mention this, is that when you're doing a presentation or an interview, I stay away from this phrase, I'm going to tell you a story. It seems to dull the enthusiasm. It seems to put people off. So instead of saying, I'm going to tell you a story, you simply go right into, I was working with Mark. He was a client of mine who was leaving his job. So you just go right into it. There's something about that phrase, I'm going to tell you a story, that the audience feels, well, I didn't ask you to, and I don't know if I'm particularly interested. So it's a phrase I tend to stay away from.
Great. So one question came up, which is, would you write the story out first and then practice speaking the story, or is there another approach that you recommend?
They're both really good approaches, and I think it might depend on your own preferred learning style. You can do it a couple of different ways. You can, I like to start with those Post-its and just bullet points, almost like a scene or an idea, but I do a lot with Post-its. On the other hand, sometimes I'll just pick up my phone and just record my thoughts. So I'm really just telling, quote, the story like in real time, and that's my practice session. And you have to begin somewhere, so it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And for some people, they prefer that. I know other people I've worked with, and they start a PowerPoint deck, and they start putting in the story in that way, and on slides, and sort of like that's their, computer Post-its. The danger with the PowerPoint slides is that you begin to think like a PowerPoint slide. So if you can get away from that. So I think it depends on what is your preferred style. You can try all three. You can try writing it out. You can just say this is the beginning. You can use Post-its. You can just talk it into a recording device and see what works for you best.
Great. And so if you're in a networking situation, how long should stories be in that scenario?
Yeah, great question. In general, I think we don't want long stories. And I think you can tell a story in 60 seconds, 90 seconds. You may see a presenter who might tell an extended story, which might go on for 5 minutes or so. Even longer. But in networking, it tends to be, I think, it's beginning, middle, and end. And in networking, you're usually revealing something about yourself. So I'm trying to give an example. I might say, one of the things I learned early on in my career was to check out what the client tells me. I had an experience where I was working with a client and heard that the issue was team building. Well, once I got there, found out that indeed the client was the issue, not the team, and that's something that I kind of carry forward to today. So that's just off the top of my head, but it is a real situation, and I could expand it out. But in networking, it might be, or even in interviewing, it tells me something about the person, and it's not very long. I don't want to lose their attention.
And how do you get people's attention prior to telling your story?
Well, as I mentioned, I don't start with, let me tell you a story, because that's a surefire way to have them drop off. I look for a strong opening, and the first couple of sentences or statements are really important. And again, in an interview, you might start at the end to tell your story. So it might be, I had an experience where I was able to take a tough situation and turn it around. So we had a client ready to walk away, and now they're one of our biggest fans. And then I'd pause and say, but let me back up and tell you more. Let me tell you how that happened. So I almost start with the big headline and then back into the details. So the first couple of sentences, a quote, a statement, a statistic, 9 out of 10, whatever it is a way. And they don't necessarily have to be exactly related to the topic. You can talk about something from another industry or something happening in social media or whatever, but then you have to make the connection. You have to make the connection. So I think it's similar to presentations where you want kind of that attention grabber to get people, you have to get their attention before they're going to listen to you.
That makes sense. And what about any tips for avoiding sounding overly rehearsed?
That's another really good question. That's a tough one, because you certainly want to be prepared. At the same time, you don't want to sound scripted. And I have found that when I have over-prepared or over-rehearsed, I don't think I've done as well as when I've been in that really perfect zone of I know what I'm talking about, yet I'm not heavily scripted. So my tip for that would be I would use my phone again to make sure that I've said this out a few times. I want to be really familiar with my content. And if I leave out something, I'm so familiar with it, I can double back and I can say, oh, let me back up a little bit. I think it's familiarity with the topic, with the story. I think that reading something, I would try to stay away from that. I think if you get to know the story, and again, they're short, that say them a few times and they're just in your brain. Your brain says, I've been here before, I remember this, I know where we're going next. And think in terms of beginning, middle, and end. And that's a tough one. You want to sound spontaneous while at the same time you're prepared. that can be a challenge at times.
Well, those are some good tips. What about a common scenario to find oneself in is having to answer, tell me about yourself in an interview? That can stump a lot of people.
There's a book by that name, Tell Me About Yourself, and the author escapes me at the moment, but that's something that I would look at. I think that you need to boil it down. And it depends, again, who is your audience, what is your purpose, what is the message, what are you looking for them to think, feel, know, do, remember, and choose. So I was an educator for a number of years, but if I weren't looking at working in an educational setting, I probably wouldn't mention that. I try to think of the things that are most relevant to my audience at hand. So if I'm in an interview and it's telling me about yourself, what are they looking for, both in skills, abilities, qualities, and then I've gone to my sort of story portfolio or my Post-its, and I've gone from an account to an accomplishment, and I'm kind of working it from there. Key pieces, of course, are going to be, your background, and I think it's really helpful to throw in some personal but not too personal things, maybe about earlier experiences. It should be the 60 seconds or so, and the job of the tell me about yourself is to have the interviewer ask you more. And I might say, if someone asked me that, I'd say, well, I'm a communications consultant. Primarily, I am a speaker, a coach, and a workshop facilitator. My approach, my goal in all of those interactions is to help my clients get their message across in business and career conversations. So I have kind of a tagline that I use to get started, and then I could go anywhere with that. And depending on the job, I could say, so I've done a great deal of design work, or I've done a lot of facilitation, or I've worked for some top companies. So I think it's kind of getting that first statement out there about who you are. So that would be my thought on that.
Great. And you refer to books. Are there some books that you recommend looking at on this topic of story and presentation?
Yeah. It's a really easy title to remember. It's called Business Storytelling for Dummies. And this is part of the Dummy series, and I don't know if you're all familiar with that. I personally don't like that title. I will tell you, this book, it's written by Karen Dietz, Lori Silverman. These are two outstanding professionals in the field. Business Storytelling for Dummies. I refer to this all the time. Selling with stories, moving stories into multiple media, getting comfortable telling stories. I'm flipping through it right now. What to do about data, how to structure a story. That's one that I think is just outstanding. And a second one is called Putting Stories to Work. And this is how to master business storytelling, which is pretty much what we're talking about today. And this just came out this year, and it's by a gentleman named Sean Callahan. Again, it's Putting Stories to Work, Sean Callahan. He's located in Australia, and he is a real thought leader in the field of business storytelling. So those are two I highly recommend.
Great. Any other questions that folks have? And you can type any additional questions into the chat box. Also, I want to highlight something that I was drawn to in Tricia's presentation were the actual slides. I love that there weren't a lot of words, that the images drew us in and kept our attention, and to me it signaled a creative presentation. So I think that if you're working with slides, that can be another option for engaging your audience. Well, before mentioning some upcoming events, I really want to thank Tricia for sharing her expertise today. This is a topic that she knows well, and I think she's shared some really helpful tips for helping us have more effective stories and presentations, and most importantly, for getting our message across. So I'm very grateful for her expertise and as an alum for her willingness to join us today.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Tricia,
I really enjoyed
so much
this
for sharing your
opportunity
expertise
to speak with you and the participants. And the last thing I would suggest to everybody is that we all have stories to tell. Go forth, find, and tell your stories.
Thank you. And I just want to mention some upcoming programs and resources from the Office of Alumni Relations. These are listed here, but a couple of websites. We have additional alumni career programs. Alumni of Northeastern are entitled to keep working with the Career Development Office, and you can even have an individual appointment in person or by phone or Skype. We do have some additional webinars coming up next month on the 20th. The Age Advantage, Making the Most of Your Midlife Career Transition. In November, Entrepreneurship, and in December, Managing Up. We also have our virtual Northeastern networking hours that happen on a monthly basis. And we have some career cafes, which are small group workshops that happen in a cafe or restaurant setting. And these are listed here, both in the Boston area, the New York area, and we'll be out in California in October. So thank you for joining us today. All of these webinars will be made available and recorded and available online as well. So thank you all for coming today. Keep an eye out for other programs and events that you can join us in. And we look forward to supporting you with your career. Thanks so much.